Wulfric stood in the center of the winter hall with blood drying in a thin line across her wrist, while the entire court watched the king decide whether she would leave as a freed woman or as a traitor's accomplice, and Brennan Bloodmoon kept his gaze on her face as if no one else in the hall could speak until she did. The banners of three packs hung above the council dais, the same three that had watched her bond rejection in 1428, and she felt that old humiliation rise like cold water in her throat when Chancellor Ivan Thorne demanded judgment. Lyra Stormborn stood under guard to Wulfric's left, jaw set, silver hair pinned as neatly as if this were any other civic hearing, while Captain Sarah Vale held a shackled assassin at the chamber doors and waited for the king's command. Brennan rested one hand on the carved arm of his chair, silent long enough that even the fire in the braziers sounded too loud, and when he finally spoke, he ignored the chancellor, ignored the elders, ignored every rank in the room, and said, "Wulfric, give me your reading." That single sentence landed harder than any accusation because she understood exactly who he had made visible and exactly where. Her pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Yet she heard her own voice answer steady, heard herself name what the ledgers proved, who had forged them, and what the forged reports had nearly done to two border keeps. The hall erupted before she finished. Thorne shouting procedure, Lyra shouting bloodline, elders shouting for closed deliberation, and Brennan rose so quickly his chair scraped stone, and the noise died in one breath. He gave no speech, no softening preface, only law in a king's voice, and she knew the floor beneath her life had already shifted. To understand why the king asked the household servant before anyone else, and why she still feared she had misread him even in that moment, it began 3 winters earlier in a courtyard where no one stepped forward when she needed one person to do it. In 1428, House Stormborn still carried enough status that people stood when they entered a public hall, and Wulfric still believed duty would be enough to earn a place in it. Her bond ceremony took place at dusk with 3 packs present because Lyra had insisted on witnesses, since alliances were easier to negotiate when everyone saw a house honor fulfilled. Wulfric wore the plain gray of Stormborn's junior line and kept her hand still in front of her while her intended, Garin Hale, stepped into the circle, inhaled once, and said he rejected the bond. He did not shout. He did not sneer. He spoke as if reading weather, and that made it worse because the rejection sounded administrative, like an entry struck from a ledger. No one argued. No one protested. Lyra did not move from her seat. Wulfric left the circle while all 3 packs watched and learned what her value was in public terms. She told herself she survived it cleanly, yet the rejection rewired her instincts in ways she could not confess even to herself. Public attention stopped feeling neutral. Attention felt like the first second before disgrace. She learned to keep her opinions private, to finish assigned tasks before anyone could critique how she did them, to prepare for the moment support vanished. Those habits looked like discipline from the outside, which pleased Lyra, and over the next 2 years discipline was what House Stormborn needed. In 1430, winter grain contracts collapsed after 2 storms ruined deliveries, and a rival house underbid emergency stock, which left Stormborn owing taxes it could not cover. Lyra signed a debt accord with the crown to prevent seizure of their lands, and everyone in the house understood that the agreement saved the name while tightening every chain attached to it. The debt accord included a lawful service clause under court charter, one household member for 3 years of labor in the High Winter Court, and Lyra called Wulfric into the archive room before dawn to announce she had chosen her. She framed it as necessity, because she always framed cuts as policy. Wulfric had no spouse, no bonded tie, no voting seat in House matters, and no direct line to the inheritance, so sending her caused the least political disruption. Lyra kept her voice gentle, which made the decision sting more. She spoke about duty, redemption, visibility, and Wulfric stood there counting the intervals between those words. hearing the old ceremony in each pause. Wulfric asked one question, whether Lyra had considered going herself, and Lyra answered with perfect calm that heads of house do not enter debt labor. Wulfric packed that morning. The ride to court in first frost of 1431 took 2 days through roads glazed hard enough to snap a horse's footing, and Captain Sarah Vale met her at the outer gate with a written order assigning Wulfric to ledger service under household authority. Sarah was younger than Wulfric expected for a command officer, and carried herself with that kind of precision that made every movement look measured, including the moment she looked at Wulfric's house seal and recognized exactly why she was there. Sarah did not pity her, and did not pretend not to know. She escorted Wulfric through servants' corridors where heat pooled low near the stone, and introduced her to Etta Voss, a senior servant whose hands were scarred from 30 winters of kitchen iron and archive ink. Etta read Wulfric once, from boots to expression, and said only, "If you are angry, keep it useful." Etta trained her in the court's internal system faster than kindness would have allowed. 2 councils each week set requisitions and war movement. Household ledgers reconciled supply counts against council orders before noon the next day. Servants never spoke in council chambers unless addressed by rank above chancellor. Wulfric learned names, seal marks, storage codes, and the pathways documents took when someone wanted paper to lie. The High Winter Court ran on ritual, yet ritual sat atop logistics, and logistics sat on numbers, and numbers told truth if no one altered them first. Wulfric discovered quickly that Etta expected clean work and moral spine in equal measure, and when Wulfric stayed late the first week to verify a border list line by line, Etta brought her tea without comment and left one quiet warning. In this building, accuracy threatens people who live off confusion. By the first council of Frost Moon Week 1, Wulfric understood enough to fear how little she understood about the people above her. She carried a ledger stack into the chamber and kept to the servant rail, while Brennan Bloodmoon entered with his guard, and the room changed in a way she felt physically before she could name it. He was not loud, not performative, not interested in wasting motion. Authority moved with him because every person in the hall calibrated themselves around what he did next. Wulfric had seen kings only at distance during festivals, where crowns made men look theatrical. Brennan looked stripped down, dangerous in his restraint, and when he took his seat she lowered her eyes and counted breaths until her pulse slowed. Chancellor Thorne opened debate on border deployments. Brennan listened. Wulfric set down the ledgers. The first interruption came before she realized it had begun. Thorne requested troop rotation toward the river flank, using casualty projections from the north, and Wulfric saw a supply discrepancy so obvious she assumed she had copied one page wrong. She checked again, saw the same mismatch, and felt her hands go cold. If those numbers stood, one unit would move with half rations into storm country. She leaned toward the nearest clerk and whispered she needed to cross-check a seal, which should have ended there. Brennan looked up as if he had heard the whisper across stone. His eyes settled on her for one unreadable beat, and he said, "Pause." The entire chamber froze. He turned his head slightly toward the servant rail and asked, "You saw something. Speak." Wulfric's stomach dropped so sharply she thought she might lose words entirely, because kings did not ask debt servants to correct war plans in open session. She explained the discrepancy with as little voice as she could manage, expecting dismissal at best. Brennan asked 2 follow-up questions in short, precise lines, while Thorne's mouth tightened and several counselors shifted in visible irritation at the breach of rank order. Wulfric answered from the ledger. Brennan ordered the deployment held pending verification and instructed quartermasters to reroute rations immediately. Dusk verification showed the unit had been hours from marching half-supplied into storm country, and the corrected order stopped the misdeployment before boots left the gate. The council moved on. No one thanked her. No one needed to, since a servant's usefulness was presumed transactional, yet the room's attention clung to her back like static as she retreated. When session ended, Thorne stopped beside her in the corridor and informed her that servants who inserted themselves into strategic debate risked disciplinary reassignment. His tone was civil. The warning was clear. Sarah arrived before Wulfric answered, stepped between them with polite formality, and escorted Wulfric to household quarters without a word. That night, Wulfric told herself Brennan had asked because emergency war powers allowed him to solicit any voice when deployment risk was immediate, and she repeated that legal fact until it felt like explanation instead of interruption. The next morning, Etta set fresh parchment on Wulfric's desk and asked whether she intended to keep speaking when asked. Wulfric said she intended to survive her 3-year term with all limbs intact. Etta gave her a look halfway between approval and warning and said survival required choosing where to be useful, because silence could be misread as consent when paper was being falsified. Wulfric slept badly. She dreamed the 1428 circle again, heard Garen's rejection in a courtroom voice, and woke before dawn with her jaw aching from clenching. When the second council of week 1 opened, she stood at the rail, determined to remain invisible unless directly ordered. Brennan entered, reviewed attendance, and before anyone else spoke, he said, "Wulfric first." The chamber reacted faster this time. One elder coughed in disbelief. Thorne set his papers down with deliberate care. Brennan did not acknowledge the reaction, and Wulfric had the disorienting sense that she was being tested and protected in the same breath, while she had no way to know why. After the week 1 correction stopped a live misdeployment, he changed the room's order of value with that one repeated choice. He asked for her reading on supply resilience if snows cut southern roads. She answered with 2 contingencies and expected him to hand the floor back upward in rank. He adopted her second option, then moved to normal agenda as if this ordering were procedural routine. That choice created immediate backlash outside formal sessions. 2 council aides began auditing every ledger she touched. A junior steward implied Lyra had arranged special treatment. Thorne sent a memorandum restricting servant access to pre-session drafts, which Sarah quietly overrode with a king's countersign by evening. Every action around Wulfric now carried stakes she had not requested. Week 2 tightened the pattern. 2 councils, 2 interruptions, 2 moments where Brennan requested Wulfric's assessment before ranking voices, and every time she answered, she felt the old humiliation fight the present moment inside her body. Public attention still felt like danger. Public attention from the king felt like standing under storm glass. She kept searching for political motives she could understand. Some reason he would use her as leverage against Thorne or against Lyra's house, since strategic use would fit what she knew of power. He gave her nothing obvious to decode. He stayed formal in chamber, almost cold, and that coldness made the interruptions stranger because he never performed warmth to soften the breach. One afternoon, she carried corrected inventory to Brennan's private clerk and passed him in the archive corridor, speaking low with Sarah. She heard only one sentence before she moved out of earshot. "If anyone pressures her through debt terms, I want names." She misread it immediately as control. Kings guarded useful assets. Kings tracked liabilities. She was a debt servant tied to a politically exposed house and had just corrected war logistics in public, so of course he wanted pressure points mapped. That interpretation settled her enough to keep functioning, and by week 3 she needed function more than comfort because casualty reports from the northern border reached council in a bundle marked urgent. Thorne presented losses with grave authority, claiming aggressive movement from rival raiders required immediate troop diversion away from trade routes. Wulfric copied figures as he spoke and felt a familiar wrongness in the cadence of numbers. The names listed as dead included 3 men she had logged in active ration requests 2 days prior. She checked twice while Thorne argued urgency, and the discrepancy widened until she understood what she was seeing. The casualty roll had 47 inflated names added across 3 companies. Her hesitation lasted one breath. Speaking now would challenge the Chancellor in open war council and could end her service in irons if she were wrong. Staying silent would send troops based on fabricated losses and leave 2 border keeps exposed when winter crossings turned hostile. The specific obstacle she had carried since 1428 was the silence reflex that protected her from public humiliation, and this was the moment where silence protected only the people altering paper. She stepped forward from the rail, asked permission to present ledger cross-reference, and Thorne objected before Brennan answered. Brennan held up one hand. Present. Wulfric read the conflicting entries, named archive stamps, named quartermaster signatures, and placed both pages on the central table. The room shifted from irritation to alarm in real time. One elder demanded authentication. Brennan ordered immediate seal verification under guard. The verification returned before session closed. 47 names had been inserted after primary filing. Thorne argued clerical contamination from field copies, an explanation plausible enough to keep him standing and thin enough to raise new suspicion, and Brennan did not accuse him that day. He restructured deployment instead. Troops meant for river diversion held central line, while fast riders were dispatched to both at-risk border keeps with corrected orders. That decision prevented immediate collapse, yet it also signaled that someone inside court had tried to redirect military force through false data, which turned every corridor into a listening post by nightfall. Wulfric returned to ledger room shaking from delayed fear, aware she had crossed from useful servant into threat vector. Etta closed the door, poured water into Wulfric's hands because the cup rattled too hard to hold, and asked if she understood what came next. Wulfric said yes. Someone would want the person who found the forgery gone or discredited before formal review could map signatures. Week 4 began with treaty hearings involving mountain envoys. Exactly the kind of public session where violence was least expected because protocol layered guard rings thick around every entrance. Wulfric attended as ledger aide to provide casualty reconciliations on demand, and Sarah assigned 2 additional watch points near the servant rail after receiving an anonymous warning that morning. Wulfric noticed Brennan seemed more still than usual, which in him looked like tension compressed to needlepoint. Hearing proceeded through tariff clauses and border passage rights until one envoy challenged Thorne's numbers, and in the small pause after the challenge, Wulfric saw a man in clerk gray shift his weight wrong near the side column. She turned toward Sarah to signal. Movement exploded first. 2 assassins drew short blades from folded treaty sleeves and drove toward the rail where Wulfric stood exposed between desks and open aisle. She had no time to run. Brennan moved before guard lines completed their break. He crossed the dais in a blur of force and hit her hard enough to knock her behind the central table just as steel flashed where her throat had been. The impact stole her breath. His arm came around her shoulders to pin her low, while Sarah's team closed from both doors and dropped the attackers in less than 10 heartbeats. 1 assassin died immediately. The second survived long enough to be shackled and dragged upright. Silence fell in violent fragments, chairs overturned, elders pale, Thorne shouting about breach of protocol, while Brennan ignored him completely and checked Wulfric for blood with hands that were shaking once he realized she was alive. She stared at him, stunned less by the attack than by the fact that the king had broken every protocol in a treaty hearing to shield a debt servant with his own body. In that moment, the narrative she had built to stay safe cracked. Strategic asset logic did not explain the way his voice dropped when he asked if she could stand, did not explain the rage he failed to hide when he looked at the bound assassin, did not explain why he kept one hand at her back until Sarah confirmed the chamber was clear. Brennan rose and issued orders in clipped lines: lock all exits, secure all record rooms, detain anyone with chamber access logs from the last 6 days, and assign Captain Vale direct authority over Wulfric's movement. Thorne protested chain of command. Brennan turned once, expression hard enough to cut, and said, "My command is the chain." The hearing ended under guard. Wulfric spent the evening in a protected room near Sarah's office while scribes took her statement and healers bound bruises from the impact. Night deepened around the fortress, and Wulfric could not sleep, because every time she closed her eyes she felt Brennan's weight driving her out of blade range and heard the wet scrape of steel on stone where she had been standing. Sarah sat nearby polishing a short sword with calm hands and finally said what no one else had. "He does not move like that for politics." Wulfric asked how Sarah could be sure. Sarah looked at her, measured, and answered that she had guarded Brennan for 7 years, through border wars, succession disputes, and one betrothal collapse that nearly destabilized the court. "He chooses caution in public at all times, except when someone reaches for what he has decided is under his protection." Wulfric had no answer. Protection implied claim, and claim implied a level of personal recognition her history told her not to believe. The next day delivered the first real window into Brennan's wound, and it arrived by accident when Wulfric was called to identify a handwriting sample in seized correspondence. She waited outside the evidentiary chamber while voices carried through half-closed doors. Brennan spoke first, low and tightly controlled. "I trusted once and paid in blood." Sarah responded with a question Wulfric could not catch. Brennan answered, "She gave patrol routes to the eastern faction. My brother died on that ridge before dawn. I learned what attachment costs a king." Wulfric stepped back before anyone opened the door, shaken by the directness of it. She had known only rumor, a broken mate-candidate arrangement years earlier that made him cold. Rumor had never included betrayal tied to family death. Suddenly, his restraint looked less like arrogance and more like armor forged by specific loss. Armor he had still set aside in the chamber when Steele came for her. Week 5 became a hunt for proof, and proof had to satisfy council law, which required evidence witnessed and corroborated before a chancellor could be removed. The obstacle was not suspicion, since suspicion saturated the court already. The obstacle was chain integrity. Every document, every seal, every testimony had to survive hostile scrutiny from people whose power depended on procedural failure. Wulfric worked beside Etta and 2 neutral clerks under Sarah's rotating guard, reconstructing casualty entries across 3 weeks to map when false names entered the system. Each corrected page narrowed possible access points. One access point tied to Thorne's office after curfew. Another tied to how Stormborn courier packets delivered through Lyra's private agent. Wulfric felt sick when she recognized her sister's hand on a transmittal notation, because this was no longer abstract corruption. This was family in the machinery that had nearly gotten her killed. Lyra requested a private meeting before formal charges were filed. Sarah refused private terms and allowed a guarded conversation in a side gallery with open doors. Lyra arrived composed, wearing storm blue wool and the same silver pin she wore at the 1428 ceremony, and she began with sisterly concern before moving straight to leverage. She said political weather had changed, that Wulfric needed to correct her prior testimony for her own safety, that procedural errors happened in wartime, and that House Stormborn could still restore Wulfric's standing once this passed. Wulfric listened while old loyalties pulled against fresh memory of blades. When Lyra implied Brennan's attention was temporary and would leave Wulfric ruined when court factions settled, Wulfric understood the exact shape of her sister's worldview. Status first. Survivability, defined as proximity to dominant power. Truth, adjustable. Wulfric stood, hand steady, and told Lyra she would testify to records as written and witnessed. Lyra's mask slipped for one heartbeat. She called Wulfric naive, reminded her she had been publicly rejected before 3 packs, and asked whether she truly believed a king would burn alliances for a failed daughter of a declining house. That sentence hit every bruise in Wulfric's history and clarified what had held her silent for years. She had spent too long accepting other people's definitions of what she was worth to protect. She answered that truth was not a bargaining chip and walked out while Lyra still spoke. The emotional shift was immediate and brutal, grief braided with relief, because choosing against her sister meant losing the last illusion that family loyalty guaranteed safety. Sarah met her at the gallery threshold and did not touch her, only said she would station double guard until hearing. Wulfric nodded and returned to evidence room, where Etta waited with fresh ink and no questions. The evidence chain closed over 3 days. Guard testimony placed Thorne's aid in restricted archives during the insertion window for the 47 names. Courier logs linked Lyra's house office to that aid through coded supply advisories. Interrogation of the surviving assassin established payment routed through shell accounts administered by a legal trust tied to Thorne's discretionary fund. None of it proved motive perfectly, yet it satisfied counsel threshold for accusation: conspiracy to falsify war records and facilitate targeted violence during treaty hearing. Wulfric had the option to remain outside final hearing for safety reasons. She chose to testify in person because without her direct ledger explanation, the defense could cast corrections as clerical misunderstanding. The specific hesitation this resolved was her fear of public scrutiny, and once she crossed that line by choice, she found her voice no longer shook when many eyes turned at once. On the morning of week 6, snow came down in dry needles that hissed against the hall windows, and the fortress moved with the heavy quiet that precedes irreversible decisions. Wulfric dressed in servant gray by habit before Etta entered with a folded dark cloak trimmed in winter white, the formal witness garment for direct testimony before full council. Etta fastened it at Wulfric's shoulders and said a simple truth that settled her breathing. "You are walking in as yourself. No one can demote that." Sarah escorted her through a guarded passage to the Winter Hall, where benches were full, pack delegates present, and the 3-pack block seated beneath their standards. Thorne stood to one side in official robes, still carrying enough dignity to look plausible. Lyra stood opposite, posture unbroken. Brennan entered last. The hall rose. When he sat, judgment began, and the entire court leaned toward whatever he would ask first. Thorne attempted procedural delay immediately, arguing wartime hearings required closed review, and Brennan denied it on grounds of public trust after attempted assassination in open treaty session. Witnesses were called in sequence: guard officers first, archive clerk second, Wulfric third. She walked to the speaking circle where she had once stood for her rejected bond, recognized the geometry of humiliation in the floor lines, and for one hard second felt 19 again. She did not retreat. She laid out the casualty falsification with dates, seals, access windows, and consequence. 47 inserted names would have redirected troop commitments away from 2 border keeps at the exact time raider activity increased, and her correction in week 3 blocked that movement. Defense counsel pressed her on rank, implying she lacked authority to interpret military logs. She answered that mathematics did not require rank and showed how ration requests contradicted declared deaths. Murmurs spread through the benches. Lyra testified next and chose strategy over sentiment, portraying the courier links as normal debt house correspondence and painting Wulfric as emotionally compromised by royal attention. Wulfric listened without interrupting, though each sentence felt like ice under skin. Thorne followed with a polished denial that leaned on process complexity, blaming underclerks, weather delays, and wartime confusion. For half an hour, the hall teetered between plausible doubt and emerging pattern. The tension broke when Sarah introduced chamber testimony from the surviving assassin, corroborated by payment records from Thorne's fund and route approvals signed by Lyra's office seal. Thorne's expression changed first, then Lyra's, and Wulfric saw in that synchronized stillness the instant both realized the evidentiary wall had closed. Brennan asked one final question, directed to Wulfric, not the accused, and the hall held its breath around his choice. He asked her reading. He asked in front of everyone who had ever treated her as expendable, and everyone who had once watched her humiliation as if it were weather, and the reversal landed so sharply she nearly lost the thread. She steadied, assessed what had been proven, and said the forged reports were intentional. The attack was facilitated from inside court, and removal under charter was warranted to protect command integrity. Brennan listened without interruption. Thorne objected to being judged through a servant's recommendation. Brennan stood and declared that under emergency war powers and confirmed conspiracy evidence, Chancellor Ivan Thorne was removed from office effective immediately. Guards stepped forward. Thorne was escorted from the hall under guard, still arguing procedure until the doors shut behind him. Brennan turned to Lyra next, voice unchanged, and ruled that House Stormborn's voting rights were suspended pending restructuring, with Lyra exiled to a border keep under supervision for her role in conspiracy. The legal verdict should have ended hearing. Brennan did not sit. He addressed the debt accord directly and stated that Lyra, as the accord's signing authority for House Stormborn, had used debt service access channels to enable the conspiracy, which constituted signatory breach under charter and triggered invalidation of service enforcement terms. That finding made Lyra's betrayal the legal catalyst that voided Wulfric's remaining debt obligation on the spot. The words hit Wulfric like sudden warmth after years of cold discipline, because one chain she had lived under since 1430 simply ceased to exist by law. She was free to leave. Brennan's eyes never left hers when he said she owed no labor, no service, no inherited penalty. In the silence that followed, everyone understood the decision had already cost him politically. Several allied houses had backed Thorne's procedural faction for stability, and voiding a debt accord with this visibility invited immediate resistance from those who depended on rigid hierarchy. He accepted that cost publicly, in full view, while rivals calculated what it meant. Wulfric thought she could breathe again until Brennan descended the dais steps and stopped an arm's length from her in the center of the hall. His next words shifted the room from legal upheaval to something older and deeper than policy. He said he had recognized her as his mate weeks earlier and had withheld claim while she remained bound by debt terms, because he would not make bond indistinguishable from coercion. The confession moved through the court like a shockwave. Wulfric stared at him, understanding all at once why his restraint had felt like distance and why his protection had kept escalating despite political nonsense. He held her gaze and, for the first time in public, let the mask fall enough for everyone to see the risk in him. I claim nothing you do not choose. I choose you. The King of High Winter offered vulnerability where decree would have been easier. For Brennan, that moment reopened the wound he had spent years sealing shut. Briefly, in the stillness after his declaration, memory pressed in. The ridge at dawn, his brother fallen because trust had been weaponized, and the vow he made afterward to keep attachment outside the range of enemies. Claiming Wulfric in full court broke that vow by design. It was the armor vow that had governed every personal choice since that betrayal, and he set it down in open view where no one could mistake the cost. He gave adversaries a target linked to his own heart and accepted the strategic danger because refusing the claim had already become a different kind of failure, one he could no longer live with. When he looked at her, he was not looking at utility or leverage. He was looking at the woman who had chosen truth when silence was safer, who had stood under public scrutiny and spoken clear. And he knew no alliance purchased by caution was worth the price of denying that recognition. Wulfric felt the court waiting for her answer like a held breath stretched to breaking. She also felt the full cost of yes. Choosing him meant stepping into permanent visibility, inheriting every factional hostility aimed at his throne, and accepting that her sister would never forgive what this verdict had become. Choosing no meant safety of obscurity with freedom newly restored, and no one could compel otherwise now that debt terms were void. Her obstacle was no longer powerlessness. Her obstacle was belief. whether she could trust that being chosen this publicly would endure beyond this hour. She met Brennan's gaze and saw no decree there, only a man who had made his risk plain. She stepped closer and said she chose him with full knowledge of the political fallout because she would rather face danger in truth than survive inside someone else's convenient lie. He touched her wrist where old bruising from week 4 still faintly showed and completed the claiming ritual in the old way: public words first, bond mark second, consent visible before all witnesses. The hall erupted, some voices celebratory, others furious, yet none could challenge the legal and biological finality now combined. Alpha recognition had identified. Kingly claim had made it irrevocable. Brennan turned immediately back to governance and named Wulfric Royal Council by charter authority, not as ornament, as office with vote on war provisioning and civil integrity review. Resistance came in the same breath, one elder calling it reckless elevation of unranked blood. Brennan answered that rank had failed where integrity held, and the court recorded his ruling. Sarah moved to Wulfric's side and formally offered sworn shield service, which Wulfric accepted, knowing the gesture meant security and trust earned through fire. After the hearing, consequences moved quickly because unresolved power vacuums invite opportunists. Thorne departed the capital under heavy guard before sunset, stripped of office seal. Lyra was escorted at dawn to a border keep where exile terms removed her voting rights and barred unsupervised correspondence for the first year. House Stormborn entered provisional stewardship, painful for Wulfric to witness despite everything, because blood does not become simple when law becomes clear. She requested one final private audience with Lyra before departure. Sarah remained within sightline while they stood in the frost-lit transfer yard. Wulfric told Lyra she would not interfere with exile terms and would not erase what happened. Lyra looked at her for a long time and said she still believed Wulfric was making herself vulnerable to a king's temporary fixation. Wulfric answered that perhaps, yet this time vulnerability was chosen, not assigned. The days that followed built a new rhythm from altered terms. Royal Council sessions now included Wulfric at the main table, and Brennan still asked her reading first in high-risk matters, this time by recognized office rather than disruptive exception. She continued reviewing ledgers with Etta, who had been promoted to Mistress of Household after exposing systemic archive weaknesses during investigation. Etta pretended not to care about the title and immediately rewrote storage protocols with ruthless efficiency. Sarah formalized her role as Wulfric's sworn shield and shifted guard rotations so protection never looked like confinement. Brennan insisted on transparency in all this, posting charters publicly so no faction could frame Wulfric's elevation as private indulgence. Political resistance remained real, especially from houses allied with Thorne's old network. Yet each attempted procedural challenge failed against documented evidence and lawfully recorded votes. Romantic fulfillment did not arrive as a single dramatic scene that erased prior damage. It arrived through repeated choices that made trust concrete. Brennan stopped issuing private orders about Wulfric without informing her first, because secrecy had become impossible for her to tolerate after years of decisions made over her head. Wulfric challenged him in council when she disagreed, including once over punitive tax pressure on a recovering village, and he revised policy after hearing her field data, despite visible irritation from hardline advisors. Their private conversations were spare and honest. He told her exactly when fear from his old betrayal resurfaced, especially during nights when patrol reports ran late and silence stretched too long. She told him when public scrutiny reopened the 1428 wound and when she needed him to choose explanation over command. Neither found these exchanges easy. Both kept showing up for them. 1 week after the hearing, Brennan convened a public council in the same Winter Hall with the same 3-pack block present for ratification of border stabilization measures. Wulfric stood beside him in Royal Council colors, aware of every eye and aware that this visibility now carried a different meaning than the ceremony in 1428. Brennan opened proceedings by requesting Wulfric's assessment of Border Keep recovery before any elder spoke, and this time, no one dared call the order improper. She delivered her analysis clearly, naming supply improvements, casualty verification reforms, and revised courier controls designed to prevent another 47 name manipulation. The three-pack delegates listened, asked hard questions, and accepted her recommendations into record. The reversal was complete, not because memory vanished, memory remained sharp, and not because everyone suddenly admired her, many still did not. Reversal came because her voice now shaped outcomes, where silence once shaped her. Winter eased toward thaw by increments, and practical evidence of change became visible in daily life. The two border keeps at risk from false reports received stable provisioning and did not fall. Council audits adopted Wulfric's cross-check protocol across all military districts. Debt labor clauses underwent review to prevent households from weaponizing assignment in political disputes, an initiative Brennan supported, though advisors warned it would anger creditor blocs. He accepted that anger as part of the cost of rebuilding trust in court law. Wulfric visited archive rooms often, sometimes with Etta, sometimes alone, touching the old ledgers that had almost buried truth under procedure and feeling the distance between who she had been on arrival and who she had become through choice under pressure. She was still wary, still carrying old scar tissue, still capable of fear in crowded halls. Fear no longer dictated silence. At the first Spring Hunt Festival, Brennan appeared with Wulfric before the wider court and surrounding packs, formal bond mark visible, royal council seal at her shoulder. Public ceremonies once meant risk for her. This one held a different charge because she entered by active choice with full knowledge of stakes. When formal vows were recited, Brennan kept to his usual concise phrasing and promised protection without ownership, partnership without erasure, and governance that would hear her voice in private and in council. Wulfric answered with her own vow that she would hold truth above convenience, hold him accountable when power drifted from justice, and stand beside him when that stance cost them both. The crowd response split across old loyalties and new respect, yet no one could deny the factual transformation in front of them. The servant assigned under debt now stood as chosen mate and governing counselor. Late that night, after protocol and feasting ended, they returned to a quiet chamber above the inner court, where wind moved softly against shutters and no one needed performance. Brennan removed his crown and set it aside, an action Wulfric had come to read as trust rather than fatigue. He asked whether she regretted choosing this life. She answered with the same honesty that first brought him to her attention, that some mornings she still woke expecting rejection. Some afternoons she still felt the old instinct to disappear when arguments sharpened, and even so she did not regret. He told her he still scanned every room for exits when she entered. A habit born from the weak assassins reached the hearing chamber, and he no longer apologized for that vigilance because he understood it as love in action. She leaned into him, steady, and the room held no hierarchy in that hour. Only two people who had paid for the right to be there. By the close of 1431, the arc that began in a public rejection had resolved through another public circle that answered it at equal scale. Wulfric was no longer the woman everyone watched being dismissed. She was the woman the king asked first, because her judgment had prevented a misdeployment, saved lives, and exposed rot. And because he had made that recognition impossible to argue away through law, through claim, and through repeated conduct that matched words. Brennan was no longer a ruler hiding inside armor so complete it left no room for shared risk. He remained formidable, remained controlled, remained king, yet the armor built after betrayal no longer governed his choices with her, and he built policy around earned trust rather than around fear. Their partnership changed court mechanics in concrete terms, and it changed the private terms of two wounded lives that had once assumed safety required distance from feeling. On a clear morning in early thaw, Wulfric crossed the winter hall before session and paused at the center circle where the stone still held faint scoring from old ceremonies. She remembered 1428 without flinching this time, remembered the three packs, the silence, Garen's voice, and she let the memory stand without letting it govern the next step. Brennan entered behind her and stopped at her shoulder, close enough that she felt his warmth through wool. Council bells rang for opening. He asked quietly, and only for her, whether she was ready. She smiled in a way that surprised her own face and said yes, because readiness had ceased to mean absence of fear. Readiness meant moving with fear and choosing anyway. When they took their seats, he opened proceedings in front of nobles, guards, and delegates, and gave the floor to Royal Counsel Wulfric Stormborn first, exactly where she belonged.